All right, so to get started here, what we're going to do is we're going to finish up with some of these utility functions that we created previously. And just to give you a reminder of where we're at here, we came to the conclusion that our express middleware contains a lot of logic that could really be pulled out into its own function and made a little bit more reusable, right? So that we'll be able to use this not only in our express middleware, but in our socket middleware. So we already did this with the load auth user from token middleware, right? Remember that this used to be called verify ID token. We just changed the name to make it a little more obvious. Essentially, what we were able to do is pull most of the important logic out into this load auth user from token function, which is right here, and that basically contains all of the important reusable logic that we can use in our sockets middleware and in our express middleware. The rest of the stuff is specific to express, as you can see, right? It's using request, it's using response, it's using request up here. This is really the only line that doesn't do that. So anyway, we're going to do that with the rest of our middleware, and we're going to see how to create socket middleware that will correspond to these new functions that we're creating. So let's open up user can edit note, which is the next one after load auth user from token. And what this one's going to look like, just to get an idea, let's start off by copying and pasting the logic from inside user can edit note middleware. All right, we're basically just going to paste this in here and take a look at what can be removed and left inside this user can edit note middleware thing. Essentially, again, we're going to be just removing everything that has to do with Express. So what this is going to look like, we're going to start off here by taking a look at the arguments of this function. Oh, and I guess before we do that, let's remove middleware from the name since it's not middleware, it's just a utility function. All right, so with the arguments here, the only thing we're really going to need is the ID of the note and the ID of the user that we want to know whether they can, edit the note or not. So what we're going to do is instead of having the full auth user and note ID that we're getting from the request, we're going to just say note ID and user ID. And actually, just to make these coincide with the name of the function, let's start off with user ID and we'll do note ID second. Okay? So once we've done that, we're going to basically be able to remove this auth user thing altogether and this note ID thing altogether. And we're going to leave this thing where we load the note because we do want to load the note by ID since that's where we'll see who the note's shared with and who owns the note. And then for this isOwner thing, instead of checking to see if note.createdBy equals authUser.uid, we can just say note.createdBy equals user ID. Okay, since we just passed that in as an argument here. So now for user permission, we're going to do something very similar. We're going to change this authUser.uid to user ID. And then for has edit access, that one we can just leave the way it is. Cool, so now that we know whether the user is the owner or whether the user has edit access, what we're going to do instead is just return true or false, can the user edit the note? Right? If the middleware does want to set this request.note thing or something like that, then they're just going to have to load the note themselves. And that's perfectly acceptable, right? We can delegate those kind of things to the actual middleware when they don't really have to do with the function at hand. Right? We just want this worrying about what its name says, which is returning yes or no, does the user have permission to edit the note? So let's remove these things here. We're going to remove that. We're going to remove next. And we're going to remove this. And what I actually want to do here is change this from a double negative, so to speak, to a regular Boolean expression, right? This makes a little bit more sense to me anyway, checking if the user is owner or whether the user has edit access. In that case, we would return true. And then otherwise, we would return false. And what we could actually do, now that I think about it, is we could reduce this down to just be return whether the user is the owner or whether the user has edit access. Okay, so that's how we know whether the user is allowed to edit the note, and that should be it for the utility function. So what we can do now is replace most of this logic inside our user can edit note middleware for Express. Okay, so we're just going to remove all of this stuff here, and we're going to actually leave the note thing so that we can set it on request.note. But first, what we're going to do is actually use our user can edit note function by saying const can edit, and this is going to be equals await user can edit note. Okay, that's our utility function, and we're passing through the user ID, which is going to be authUser.uid, and the note ID we're just getting from the request parameters. This is the stuff that's specific to Express now, right? So that's what belongs inside this user can edit note middleware. So now that we know whether or not the user can edit, what we're going to do is say if the user can edit. Well, in that case, what we want to do is actually load the note and set request.note equals note. And we're going to return true from here, saying that this middleware has successfully completed. And then we're going to call next here to show that everything went as planned. And I'm going to delete that next down here. Now, on the other hand, if everything did not go as planned, you probably know the drill. We're going to say request.send status. And this is going to be a 403 status, telling the user that they do not have the required permission to do whatever they're trying to do. All right. Oh, and this would be response.send status. Duh. All right. Cool. So that's our user can edit note middleware refactor. The next thing that we're going to do now is write the same kind of logic for our socket middleware. All right. So if we open up our socket middleware, and we're going to create a new file in here with the same name as this one. In fact, what I'm going to do instead actually is just copy this user can edit note middleware file and paste it inside our sockets middleware. There we go, and what we're going to do is rewrite this so that it works with our sockets instead of with Express, all right? So here we go, let's just close these other things. And what we should do here, let's take a look at what we did in our previous sockets middleware, just to remind ourselves how that worked. So basically, this middleware just took a socket, and if everything went well, then we returned true, and we could set whatever other information we wanted on the socket as well. If some kind of error happened, we basically emitted an error event through the socket and sent along a message, and then we returned false, which is sort of the equivalent of what in Express would have just been not calling the next callback. So that's our basic structure there. Let's go back to user can edit note middleware for our sockets, and we're going to change the arguments here, of course, to just socket. And then getting the user is going to look a little bit different. Instead of saying request.user, we're going to say socket.user, right? So just like with Express, we're just kind of making the assumption inside this middleware that we've already loaded the user via the load auth user from token middleware, because otherwise we don't really know who the user is. So that's just kind of an assumption we're making, and we'll just have to make sure that in all of our definitions, we actually put the load auth user from token middleware before this middleware if we want to use it. Okay, so we have auth user now, and we're going to get the note ID from socket.handshake.query. Okay, so that's just the place that we get it from in socket.io. And for can edit now, it's going to actually look pretty much identical to what we had before. We're getting the authUser.uid and note ID. So all good there. And now down here, we're going to do something very similar to what we did in Express, except we're going to write the socket.io version of this, so to speak. We're going to check if the user can edit the note, and we actually don't even need to set note on our socket, so we can just delete that altogether. And what we're going to do is return true if the user can edit the note, saying that everything is good and we're all good to proceed with whatever the next piece of logic is. Otherwise, we're going to return false. Now, in this case, too, we can just return this can edit thing. So what I'm going to do is just move this all and say return can edit. So essentially, whether or not we allow the socket to do what it's trying to do is going to depend on this can edit variable here. And that should be all we need to do for our user can edit note middleware. All right, so again, you can see how this user can edit note utility function that we pulled out here makes it a lot easier to create middleware for different kinds of technologies, right? We can create one for Express and one for socket.io, and we don't have to rewrite that logic over and over again. So again, what this means is if we wanted to change how we determined whether or not a user could load a note, we would just have to come into this utility function and, I don't know, let's say that we changed the edit string to all capitals. We could just change that here, and we wouldn't have to change it in multiple places as we would if we just had repeated this logic in all of the different middleware for all of the different technologies. All right, so that was the user can edit note middleware conversion. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.